Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jeffrey Nahm, and I'm an events manager for Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. YPFP works to build the leaders tomorrow needs. We do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, and a global community of peers. We are delighted to have Ambassador Marc Grossman join us today for a candid conversation about diplomacy and his career in foreign service. Following my conversation with the ambassador, I'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Grossman. Ambassador Grossman is a distinguished career diplomat. He has served as the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey, the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Director General of the Foreign Service, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is also currently Vice Chairman of the Cohen Group, an international business advisory firm. Ambassador Grossman, thank you for joining us today.
Jeffrey, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So Ambassador, you've had a long career at the State Department. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started at the Foreign Service and what made you stay?
Sure, thank you. And first of all, let me just thank everybody for taking time this evening. And what a great and important group this is, Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. We need a next generation and a next generation of leaders, so thank you very much. So Jeffrey, I didn't know anything about the Foreign Service. I was born and raised in California, in Los Angeles. I grew up there. I went my 90 miles north to college. I went to University of California, Santa Barbara. And then I'm sure, like a lot of people on this call, one of those events happened to me. And I had a professor, and I really to this day don't know why he paid very much attention to me, but he called me in one afternoon as I was a junior at UC Santa Barbara. And he said, Mark, UC Santa Barbara is great. You've learned how to surf and you've learned how to play Frisbee, but perhaps you need a little bit more of an education. And he encouraged me to go on an education abroad program. And I did. And I spent my senior year at the University of Birmingham in England. And I got the bug. I got the bug for being interested in how other people live their lives. I got a bug for being interested in how other people make decisions, how they set priorities, other cultures. And I stayed another year. I got a master's degree at the London School of Economics. I went back to Santa Barbara, and I went back to a job I'd had before, selling things door to door. And I thought, this is great, but it's not the long-term answer to the question. And I started looking around for who was going to pay me to pursue this curiosity I had in other people and other people's cultures. And luckily for me, I found the Foreign Service. I took my exam one Saturday morning at UC Santa Barbara. I passed. I took my oral exam at the Federal Building in Los Angeles. I passed. And about a year later, I was invited to Washington to join the Foreign Service. I'd never been on the East Coast of the United States before. I really had no idea what I was getting into, but for me, it turned out to be exactly the right thing.
That's amazing to hear. Yeah, I feel like we don't always know exactly what we want to do until we, get exposure to it, and then, things just start rolling from there.
Well, that's right.
So,
one of the things that's interesting, I think, in talking to people, especially nowadays, is people forget how random some of these things are. If no professor helps you out, I don't go to the Education Abroad program, maybe I'm a lawyer. And so I think the important thing for people to take away is you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but you have to be ready to grab the opportunities when they go by.
Definitely need to be adaptable. I definitely can relate to that. So let's talk a little bit about your experiences in diplomacy. So there are times when, diplomatic efforts involve the cooperation of, multiple agencies and departments. While it may seem like the best approach involves a diverse set of skills, experiences, and subject matter expertise, there are some difficulties that accompany interagency approaches. What have you found as some of these large obstacles, and how have you been able to overcome them?
Well, thank you very much. That's a great question. And there is, as you say, a balance between trying to do things yourself or with one agency and really following an interagency approach. I think the most important way to overcome that particular problem, and it's a big one, is from the very top. and where people at the top, the President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, say that our philosophy is we're going to have a whole of government approach. We want to bring the entire resource of the US government to bear on these problems. And I had the good fortune in 2 occasions, and probably others, but certainly in 2 occasions, to be the leader and beneficiary of that. When I was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, we were running what was then called Plan Colombia. And Plan Colombia is, in my view, and there may be people who disagree with me, but in my view, one of the great success stories of American foreign policy over the last 20 or 25 years. It was through a series of administrations, Republican and Democrat, and people believed that the answer to our effort to support the Colombians as they were fighting for their own democracy was it wasn't just about counter drugs, wasn't just about human rights, wasn't just about economics, wasn't just about a military assistance program. It was all of those things together. And so we pursued what was a real whole of government approach to our support for Colombia. And I'd say by and large, it worked pretty well. You were kind enough to mention I was recalled to the government to be the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there, Ambassador Dick Holbrooke, who I had taken over from, as you recall, sadly died while he was on the job at the State Department. They had also set out to do a whole of government effort. And they brought people together physically at the State Department. And it was another place where we tried to bring things together. And in my view, it worked better than trying to fight about it all the time. The other place where this works, and again, those of your audience who might have served abroad in the Foreign Service or the Civil Service and the military know that the country team aspect and thought works pretty well, where the Ambassador of the United States of America has a letter from the President and says, you're in charge here of everything that has to do with the government, with the exception of 1 or 2 things. And that's a whole of government approach that works extremely well for us overseas.
Yeah, I definitely can agree with that. I think as long as everyone who's part of that team has the same goal, I think we can overcome some of the difficulties that come around with, interagency cooperation, as you say.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
So as special representative of Afghanistan and Pakistan, you were put in a position to negotiate with a wide array of parties, all of whom who had different interests and motivations, whether it was the Afghanistan and Pakistan governments, the Taliban, or anyone in between. How did you manage negotiating with all these multiple parties, and what considerations did you find most important throughout the process?
Well, that's a great question. And as you say, it was a kaleidoscope of people and interests. What we tried to do, Jeffrey, was to meet the standard that you just set in your last question. We tried to set out really clear goals. And then we tried to create a set of institutions to meet those goals. So I was extremely lucky. Ambassador Holbrooke died. I don't mean that I was lucky about that, don't get me wrong, but Ambassador Holbrooke passed away. And Mrs. Clinton, then Secretary of State, was giving a speech in February of 2011 in honor, actually, of Ambassador Holbrooke. And we were essentially able to write our own instructions, our own goals, our own objectives, and put them into a public speech, which she gave at the Asia Society in New York in February of 2011. And using that speech, we tried very hard then to bring parties together in various ways. So first we thought to ourselves, we want to make sure that the region is involved. And we wanted to make sure that we use the calendar in the right way. So we created, with the support of the Turkish government, a meeting in November in Istanbul to try to bring the region to support Afghanistan. There was then, as you'll recall, a NATO meeting early in 2012 in Chicago, where we brought NATO to the table in a very important way. They'd already been doing a lot, but we tried to focus it. There was a meeting in Tokyo, which focused on the economic aspects of support for Afghanistan. So all these things we tried to do was to bring all these groups together. We were constantly on the road, as you can imagine, talking to people, trying to get people to understand where we were headed. I was greatly benefited by the fact that a number of other governments had appointed special representatives as well. So I had a wonderful group of people to work with, and we did our best. I'd say that the the negotiation with the Taliban was kind of set aside from that. It was different than that because it was just very complicated. We used to do it in Doha and Qatar, where they still do this work. I tried my best. We negotiated with the Taliban for 6 or 7 months. We tried to create an atmosphere where we could get a series of confidence building measures going, at the end of which would have been a conversation among Afghans, right? Afghans have to solve this problem. I talked about it as Afghans talking to other Afghans about the future of Afghanistan. But we tried to help them get there. We failed. The negotiation ended in the spring of 2012 for various reasons that we can talk about if anybody's interested. But it didn't work out. And it's just one of the reasons that I'm a supporter of the work that Ambassador Khalilzad is doing now. Having failed at this, I hope he succeeds.
Thank you for the answer. Kind of building off of that, how do you deal with setbacks that might arise during the process of negotiations? Whether it's between the Taliban or Afghan and Pakistani governments, how do you deal with unforeseen outcomes?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to recognize that these unforeseen outcomes, they're bound to happen. And so, you think about the 2 years I was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. We had events that we could never have predicted. People killing each other, people bombing each other, killing each other by mistake. At one point we killed, a very large number of Pakistanis by mistake in an air raid, Pakistani soldiers. So you have to recognize at that level that things are going to happen. And you have to be, as you said before, pretty flexible, and you have to just keep going. That's why it's so important, and I'm sure everybody on this call, whether you're in the private sector or the government sector, NGOs, that's why these objectives are so important, is that you've got to have some North Star to keep working toward, and you have to be very disciplined not to lose your path. Now, often I would sit, especially when I was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, or again as the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and things would happen. And people would say, what are you going to do about this? And I'd say, well, I'm only going to do a little bit about this because my big goal is still over here. And I'm focused on it. And I've got to persevere. And so being resilient and to persevere is a really important thing. One of the things that is about diplomats is a lot of people think diplomats are pessimists, right? So, you'd have to be a pessimist to be a diplomat. I actually think the best diplomats are optimists, because why else would you get up every morning trying to solve these problems? And you think about the diplomatic efforts of our country and other countries over the years, these take years. They take months. This is really hard work. And so you've got to have a goal, and you have to be focused on that goal. You have to be prepared to persevere.
That's a great point you make. I feel like if I was in your position, I would dread any phone call or text message, hoping it isn't some unforeseen outcome that, pushes things back.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the hard things, is that when the phone rings in the middle of the night, you think this can't be good, and it's not to be, but you got to deal with it.
Great. So now we have all seen a change in the way we conduct business and our lives due to the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been a temporary shift towards virtual forums as opposed to traditional face-to-face interactions. How do you think this has affected diplomacy now and moving forward?
Well, I think if you step back for a minute, Jeffrey, I think there's an important conversation that you all will be having, because you're the next up here in terms of leadership. But I think about COVID this way. First of all, I don't think, things aren't going back to the way they were. And I think that's an illusion, that there'll be a vaccine and suddenly everything will be like it was. I don't think that. I had a friend say the other day, we're not moving to the new normal, we're moving to the new. And nobody knows what that's all about. So there's enormous uncertainty. Second thing is, you say, COVID has so rapidly accelerated some of the trends that were out there anyway, right? So Zoom it existed before, but 10 million people were using it a day, not 300 million people a day. You know?
Mm-hmm.
You think about the number of people who are now going to the doctor on Zoom or any of the platforms. So it's accelerated these trends. And third, I think, and I speak just as a former diplomat here, the other thing I think is that it's opened up, for me anyway, the thought, and again, people can agree or disagree. It's opened for me the thought that there's now a misalignment between what citizens need, healthcare, access to justice, you know, all the things that have been shown these last several months, and how leaders define the national interest. And I think there's a misalignment there. And one of the interesting things will be whether this alignment can be realigned and how.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some big questions out there. In terms of the platform, whether it's the electronic platform, Zoom or Microsoft Teams, I'm not sure anybody knows yet how it's going to affect diplomacy. In some ways, it'll be a big positive, just like this meeting. Think about trying to organize this meeting if everyone had to come together in person. It'd be impossible, right? Or you wouldn't have 64 people, you'd have 14 people. And so some of this is going to be, will be positive. But as I think about, you talked about negotiations before. So let's say you're in a big negotiation on Zoom. So where do you make a concession? How do you take somebody aside and go, hey, let's go take a walk here for a minute, because I don't really understand what you're trying to say. Or if I said this, what would you say to it? And a lot of diplomacy, as you all know and your audience knows, that's how it gets done, right? You take a walk with somebody and you say, this isn't the official position of my government, but what if this is what I said? This is really hard if you're doing this on Zoom with 66 people watching.
Mm-hmm. Definitely can agree with that. So related to that, you've made that transition to the private sector, becoming vice chairman of the Cohen Group, an international business advisory firm. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how your transition was, what you do now, and how COVID-19 has had an effect on what you do today?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd say my transition was actually pretty easy. And the reason it was easy, Jeffrey, was that one of the things I loved to do when I was the ambassador to Turkey, the assistant secretary for European affairs, the undersecretary for political affairs, I loved helping American companies do business abroad. I thought commercial work was interesting and fun. I got to meet a lot of interesting people. We created a lot of jobs in the United States. I felt it was one of the most important jobs that our representatives can do abroad. And so what we do in the Cohen Group is kind of mostly similar, right? We try to help American companies do business abroad. We have some clients who want to do business here, but the majority of our clients are people who are doing work abroad, which is something that I knew I loved and I knew I enjoyed. And, I had some little experience in it. So the transition wasn't very jolting to me because I had done this in my previous life and as I say, enjoyed it very much. I think the way the transition is that is trying to keep clear on objectives. So in the private sector, of course, making money, making profit, value to investors, value to stakeholders, who's responsible to who, the fiduciary responsibility. That's a really important thing that most people in government don't have. Some people do, but most people do not. Money just sort of appears in government. The Congress appropriates it, OMB gives it to you, it lands on your desk. That's not, of course, the way it is in the private sector. So you need to learn that difference. In terms of COVID, our experience so far has been mixed, I'm sure, which is true of lots of companies. Some people have been very badly damaged by this, and so that's been hard. In other ways, though, it's opened up questions that people had never kind of thought to answer. We're now helping people with supply chains. We're helping people look for new businesses. We're helping people, who want to participate in operation, in the operation to get a vaccine. And so, these crises and these events open up new challenges, and you try to meet them.
That's a great point you make. So now I noticed that you have been busy with some special projects outside of your work as well. One of them includes a recently released novel, which I'm sure draws upon your experiences abroad. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, thanks. Yeah, a friend of mine and I just put out a novel. I'd had this idea rolling around in my head for a few years that on November the 4th, 1979, the day the hostages were taken in Iran, and you all were, you all think of this as history. I kind of lived this. That there was one more Foreign Service officer in Iran, and she didn't get taken. And what would be her life? What would her life be like after that event? And what would her life be like over time? And I had this idea, and I realized I couldn't write it myself because I didn't know that much about Iran. And so, although I did that crisis from Washington, I didn't know much about Iran. So I asked a friend, John Limbert, who had been a hostage actually himself and knew a lot about Iran, to join me. And so together we wrote this book. We loved it. It was really fun. It was something I'd always wanted to do. So far, people have been very kind about it on Amazon. And, it's just one of those things. We wanted to tell a good story. It's fiction, right? So we wanted to tell a good story. We wanted to highlight the Foreign Service and our diplomats and our military people and people from other agencies, their service and their honor. And we wanted to just, as I say, tell a good story. And we've been telling people we hope people have as much fun reading it as we did writing it. So thank you for mentioning it.
Definitely looking forward to reading that.
You're very kind. Thank you.
So I have one last question before the audience takes over. So audience members, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A section, and then I will go ahead and ask my last question and then proceed to ask those. So despite making the transition to the private sector, it seems like you still have an invested interest in our foreign service. The Harvard Kennedy Schools for Future of Diplomacy Project launched an initiative called the American Diplomacy Project, a foreign service for the 21st century. As a leader of this project, can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, I sure will. Thank you. And you're right. I mean, I spent 32 years as a diplomat in one form or another, and I have great admiration for those people who are serving our country, not just at the State Department, but all around. But the State Department is close to my heart, and so a number of us, Ambassador Nick Burns, Ambassador Nancy McEldowney, Ambassador Marcy Reese, we decided that if we had an opportunity to think about this a little bit, what would we say? And so Harvard University was kind enough to be a host where Ambassador Burns teaches. We raised a little money, and we're looking to put out a report after the US election, so it's nonpartisan, bipartisan, with just some ideas about how you would take the Foreign Service forward. And we don't want to be Republicans and Democrats. We just want to help the people who are serving our country today. Jeffrey, we've had now about 8 or 9 workshops, or maybe a little bit more. We've listened to a lot of people, retired people, people in the service, people who were younger who left the service because they didn't like it, people who are consumers of the service, people who rely on the Foreign Service, all kinds of different people. And we've just now started to kind of think about what have we heard and what's next. Our goal is to maybe start to talk about some of the preliminary recommendations and get some feedback from people in the public, and then take it to really senior people, maybe some former secretaries of state, and say, so what do you think? And then just after the election, put it out there to whomever will be president on January 2021, and hope we have some effect. So I appreciate your asking, and we've been very, very pleased with the response, both from the administration, very helpful, and from people all around. I think there's a general sense that that diplomacy needs some new thinking.
I think that's a great idea. I think there's a whole lot of experts such as yourself, bringing their wealth and knowledge into that report, and I think a lot of people can benefit from it. So I hope it gets put into work in the State Department and such.
Well, I hope so too. What we've said to those we've interviewed is that we want to do this to give it over to the people who work at the department now. It's for them.
Great, great. So that concludes my discussion with the ambassador. I appreciate you asking or you answering all my questions. So I will go ahead and proceed to the Q&A section to ask some of the questions from our audience members.
Okay.
So the first question we have here is, what best prepared you for this line of work when you were younger?
What best prepared me for this line of work were three things, really. One is I was really an avid consumer of information from a young age. I'd say I was a great reader. I know that that's not such a good thing anymore for all of you. You consume information in a different way. But so I say I was a very interested consumer of information. Second thing was, as I described, I was really got the bug. I was taken by these questions of how do other people decide what their lives are going to be like? How do they set their priorities? And third, and I didn't come to this kind of early in my time, maybe a little bit later, perhaps after a year or two that I was in the Foreign Service. I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara from 1969 to 1973. And those of you who know the history of that time will recognize that it probably wasn't the most patriotic time to be a university student in the United States. But I turned out to be very patriotic. And I turned out to be very interested in serving the United States. I didn't know that at the time. It came to me a little bit later. But it was also something that, once I realized that, helped me prepare for the effort that was going forward. The other thing is that I laughed a little bit before, after I came back, all during my time in college, and afterwards when I came back to Santa Barbara from my time at England, I sold stuff door to door. I was a door-to-door salesman. And you can say, what's that have to do with this? I'll tell you what it has to do with it. Is that if you work every day on commission and you have to knock on doors all darn day, you learn to persevere and you learn to knock on doors and you learn to keep going. And it was all the things that I tried to answer Jeffrey with before. You know, why could I persevere in this career? Because I'd learned that at a young age too. And finally, if you sell stuff door to door, you can talk to anybody. And so I'm glad to talk to anybody. And that turned out to be a pretty good thing for being a diplomat.
Yeah, that sounds great. I used to be something like that as well. And you get used to the word no really quickly.
Yes. Yeah, but you heard no, and then you went on to the next door, right?
Exactly.
And that's part of the curiosity. What's on the other side of the door? How do other people live? So I think for me, it just, you know, I had a series of experiences that let me get through this time in diplomacy.
It's great. So the next question I have here, it's from Alexander Neubecker. He states that, and the ambassador states that foreign policy is dependent upon getting buy-in from both Congress and the people of the United States. Due to our current polarized environment, how is the State Department currently involved in this process and how could they improve?
Well, I imagine it's really hard now because, as you say, and the questioner says, things are so divided. Again, I was lucky. I came up through the system at a time where, you know, there were people in Congress and people in the administration who could talk to one another and come to some way forward. It's harder now. There's no question about that. The reason I raised, Jeffrey, in the answer to your question about COVID is I hope people will step back a little bit and see this misalignment between national interest and citizen interest. And perhaps, Alexander, perhaps, if you could pose the question in that way, you know, let's Congress and the executive sit down and say, is our definition of the national interest really meeting citizen interest? Is it doing so in trade? Is it doing so in health? Is it doing so in climate? Is it doing so in our military posture abroad? And I think if you could start asking questions in that way, that perhaps there might be a way forward here. But one of the reasons I admire people who are serving our government today, not just at the State Department, but all around our government, is that people are there, trying to carry out the will of the people and of the Congress, and I'm sure it's a challenge.
I definitely stand for a higher cause, that's for sure. So this next question is from Aplana. The person wants to thank you for your work in Kosovo, and they're actually a former refugee. Could you please expand on your experience during the Kosovo War?
Yes, well, thank you, and I'm glad to hear from you. Yes, I was the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs and took over at a time when Bosnia and the original Balkan wars had started to sort themselves out through Dayton and other agreements. But Kosovo has remained an enormous challenge. And I'd say that we took our guidance and we took our philosophy from President Clinton, but certainly from Madeleine Albright. And one evening, Madeleine Albright said to me, "Mark, we are not going to have people put in boxcars for the second time in the 20th century. And we are going to focus on this Kosovo problem, and we're going to try to do the right thing for everybody in the area." And we did, as you know from the history very well. This was an effort that went on for months and months and months of diplomatic effort to try to bring Serbs and Kosovars together in some fashion, deal with this in a peaceful manner. And it failed. And one of the most difficult times in my entire diplomatic career was the 2 weeks we spent at Rambouillet, France, trying to bring the two parties together. It was a complete failure. And the United States decided, and our allies decided, that we were going to live up to our principles in Kosovo, and we acted militarily. And it was an enormous risk. But it worked out, I think, as best as it could. Not everything is perfect, but the fact that there's an entity, Kosovo today, speaks to some of that important effort. One of the challenges in diplomacy is that once you deal with these, sometimes when you manage these questions for a while, people go on to other things. And I notice, I'm no big expert, but I notice, there's still a lot of problems in Kosovo, many challenges in Serbia, many challenges in the Balkans, many challenges that Dayton thought that they had solved. And so this is a matter of you got to keep focused on problems to make sure they stay manageable or stay solved. But when I look back, yes, there are things that I might have done differently, things that I might have hoped would go differently. But I look back on our intervention in Kosovo as one of the things I'm most proud of, actually, in my career.
Yeah, definitely a remarkable time to be in, definitely a difficult time. So the next question I have here is from Khalil. What specific items hindered the deals with the Taliban? And kind of a second part to that question, in Colombia, did you have to negotiate with the FARC? And if so, how did that look?
Yeah, I'll take the second question first. No, I did not. During the time I was there was no negotiation with anybody on that side, the FARC, the ELN, the AUC. So no, I did not. That comes later in the story. As you recall, they made these negotiations in Cuba. There was a U.S. Special Envoy, Bernard Aronson, who tried to help out, but no, I did not. In terms of my time negotiating with the Taliban, when I think back on it, Khalil, I think in the end, the challenge was that the negotiation ended up about prisoners. As you'll recall, the Taliban was holding a U.S. Army sergeant, Bo Bergdahl, and one of my jobs was to try, along with many, many other people, but one of my jobs in the negotiation was to try to get him free. We were holding also a number of Taliban prisoners at Guantanamo, and the Taliban wanted them to be free. And so although I put these negotiating efforts into the series of steps that I was trying to negotiate, in the end, we couldn't get over the problem of the prisoners. We never really got to substance. Taliban wanted their people, we wanted Sergeant Bergdahl. And we never could come to an agreement. And so my negotiation ended, I believe, primarily because we couldn't form a series of confidence building measures and deal with the prisoner question at the same time. There were lots of other reasons. The government of Afghanistan was very suspicious of what I was doing. The Taliban itself had many factions, as you can imagine. But I think primarily my negotiation became about these prisoners, and it just wasn't going to work. I'd say Ambassador Khalilzad's got other challenges. Bergdahl got out a year or so after I left the job. Some of the main prisoners from Guantanamo are gone, so that he hasn't had to deal with this question. But he's had a lot of hard problems. And violence continues. One of his challenges, of course, is the Taliban looks at him and says, so why should I negotiate with you? Because your troop numbers are going down every couple of months, right? So I'm going to achieve my goals without having to give you anything. So that's hard for him. The government of Afghanistan, fights, has a lot of challenges. So he's got a big job. And as I said, having failed at this, I hope he succeeds.
Definitely a difficult job. Thank you. So the next question is from Justin. Air Force General Curtis LeMay once said, "The Soviets are our adversary, our enemy is the Navy." You've been speaking about the need to work with people and get them together on the same page. Could you discuss an example in which you had to manage interagency situations in which different agencies had different goals?
Sure. That happens a lot. I'd say kind of my recollection really would go back to Khalil's question. It was hard sometimes to get the interagency all going in the same direction about supporting my negotiation with the Taliban. Because you can imagine, when I started there, we had 100,000 young men and women in uniform in Afghanistan. And so my military colleagues said, you can go negotiate, but we're the real effort here. And that was right. And we had many other challenges that sometimes pushed the negotiation down to the bottom of the agenda. So I spent an enormous amount of my time, just as you say, Justin, trying to get the interagency organized so that I could go to these negotiations. And one of the ways I did that was I created a negotiating team. So there was a representative there from the National Security Council. There was a representative there from the Defense Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to try to bring everybody together at the face of this negotiation, at the point of attack, so that if we could work as a team there in Doha, that we hope to communicate back to Washington that they needed to support us like a team. I don't pretend it worked all the time, but that was certainly our goal. And so, when you think about diplomacy in Washington, if you're the Undersecretary for Political Affairs or the Special Representative or anybody really, a lot of diplomacy is with the foreign governments and foreigners, but an enormous amount of diplomacy is with the interagency. And how many times I went over to see the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, all of the people who had some say in what I was trying to do, so that people were never surprised and they could understand what I was trying to do, I hope, and that I could take their advice early on in the process.
It's definitely difficult to get everyone on the same page, even if the overarching goal is the same. So the next question is a little bit about your early years. What was your work and average day like as a low to mid-level diplomat / FSO before serving in your more prestigious positions?
Well, my very first post was Pakistan. I went to Pakistan in the spring of 1977. And I had the good fortune there to be what was called a rotational officer. Over my 2 years, I had the opportunity to serve in various parts of the embassy. And it was there a little bit like the story of, this professor who took an interest in me. And again, I'm sure all of you have had this experience. it was there I also recognized the enormous importance of mentors. I was so lucky in Pakistan. The ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, my various bosses, people were prepared to teach and to be examples. You know, you're not born to be a diplomat, or I suppose some people are. I sure wasn't. So you need to watch. How does this work? What's it mean to be a diplomat? And so my first rotation was through the economic section. I learned a lot about the Pakistani economy. I learned a lot about helping American businesses in Pakistan. And I learned how the economic section fit into the rest of the embassy. I then did a rotation through the administrative section. I was the personnel officer, which turned out to be an extremely important teaching tool for me because I ended up as the Director General of the Foreign Service. So I wasn't afraid of personnel issues because I'd seen them from the very first time I was in Pakistan. I did a rotation in the political section. And there my job was to be out each day trying to talk to as many Pakistanis as I could. And I was so junior. You know, I was talking to the third director of the political party in Lahore, but I was learning to be a diplomat. And I learned to drink tea and ask questions. And I learned to go back and write it up and send it back home so that somebody in Washington, D.C. could make some sense of it. I also learned from my mentors. The ambassador would from time to time poke his head in and say, Mark, I'm going to see the foreign minister. You want to come? Absolutely. And then I would write up the cable that reported the conversation. I'd turn it into him and he'd say, you know, this is not so good. But was prepared to work with me to make it better. And then I did a tour in the consular section. I was the backup consular officer. And I learned about the importance of visas and American citizen services. And a lot of people say to me now, oh, I don't want to serve in, you know, why do I want to be a consular officer? Why do I want to stamp visas? And I say to them, listen carefully to me. Number one, visa officers generally have more contact with the host nation than anybody else in the embassy. Two, visa officers, especially young officers, generally supervise more people than anybody else in the embassy. And third, if you're the DCM or the ambassador, what two parts of the embassy can really, really cause you a lot of trouble? Well, if it's your consular section's not doing the right thing, either by your host government or by American citizens, or if your administrative section is not doing the right thing by, oh, let's say, you know, looking after the cash. And if you don't understand how to speak that language, then you can't supervise it in a real way. So I tell people, do that consular tour, do it with your full heart, because someday it'll help you be a better leader.
I think you brought a great point. I never really thought of it that way, but definitely changed, I feel like, a few people's minds on that. So the next question is kind of related to that. It's from Meenakshi. What are skills aspiring foreign service officers can bring to service to the State Department to help strengthen it and also help realign U.S. interests with what U.S. citizens need and want?
Well, that's a great question. And let me say that the skills that people need to come to the Foreign Service with are exactly the same skills we're looking for now at the Cohen Group. So whether you're listening to this from the private sector, the NGO sector, or the public sector. So what are we looking for? What did we look for as Foreign Service officers? One is we're looking for people who are thrilled and honored to serve their country. Two, as I said before, we're looking for people who are naturally curious. What's on the other side of the door? Now, I'd like to go to this city and learn what's out there. So there's a natural curiosity that makes a good Foreign Service officer. Third is this capacity to be resilient. One of the things I've noticed in this COVID time is my Foreign Service family, my larger Foreign Service family, you know, it's not great, but people are pretty resilient if you've been a Foreign Service officer because you've been through events, not like this, but things happen. And you have to deal with it because you're in a foreign country, so you deal with it. So resilience is also a very important thing. And then in terms of substance, it's several things. One is, I know this is a Twitter universe, right? But the Foreign Service is still about the written word. And we need Foreign Service officers to be able to write clearly and quickly and persuasively. And that's exactly what we're also looking for at the Cohen Group. And then similarly, we need people who can present, to stand up in front of senior people in your own government or people you're going to go try to persuade in a foreign government. And you need to be able to present in an effective and persuasive and friendly and good way. And that's exactly what we tell our young people at the Cohen Group, right? That first time you're client facing, you need to be able to present because you're our face. And so these, I think, are, people can say, oh, writing, what an old-fashioned skill. It's not an old-fashioned skill at the State Department. It's not an old-fashioned skill in diplomacy. And I can tell you it's not an old-fashioned skill at the Cohen Group. So writing, presenting, and doing it quickly and accurately, I think are among the most important skills. I don't know, to connect this to the larger question of national interest and the State Department. I don't know. Because that's more, I think, of kind of leadership taking on these questions and then guiding people to the answer and bringing people along. But I'd say that if you're interested in the service, the Foreign Service or the diplomatic service, or any of the other things that I know about on the national security side, it's this curiosity, resilience, patriotism, writing, and presentation.
Yeah, I definitely think sometimes we put too much value on mathematical skills or technical skills, but not as much value on the soft skills you just said about verbal and written communication. So definitely nice to hear that from you. So this next question is from Molly. How do you recognize when negotiations or other diplomatic efforts have reached the point of failure? Furthermore, what are the best strategies to re-enter negotiations or foster the perseverance necessary to complete your intended goal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Molly. One of the very first people I went to see when I became special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, I went to see Henry Kissinger. And I said, okay, so you negotiated for all these years with Vietnam. What happened? How was it? And what mistakes did you make? And what did you do right? And he said to me, Mark, he said, the thing you have to be most careful of, wonderful European way, he said, you have to be careful about taking too much salt on your tongue. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, Mr. Secretary, you got to help me. What's that mean? He said, salt on your tongue tastes really good. And when you want some, you want a little more and a little more and a little more. And so he said, you have to be very careful here to, just as you said, Molly, kind of understand what your parameters are in this negotiation. And when they're not solving the problem or creating more problems, or you aren't going to get to the end, then you have to not be seduced by, well, I want some more salt, right? I'm the negotiator, so I'm supposed to negotiate. And so one of the things that we did in getting ready for the negotiation with the Taliban was we had a team, a red team, who played the Taliban. And so we practiced and we practiced and we practiced. And I got a sense of where it was gonna, where it was not gonna, if it wasn't gonna go, it wasn't gonna go. And in that negotiation, as I said to Khalil, it had to do with the prisoners. I finally realized we weren't gonna solve this problem. And I realized I had not enough backing from President Karzai, who was the president of Afghanistan at that time. He wasn't gonna back me, no matter what I did. And I thought, we're done, right? We can't do this anymore. Your second question about how do you get back in it? Well, that's interesting and hard. One of the ways we tried to do it was we asked Mrs. Clinton to make a speech, actually at Hampton Roads or somewhere in Virginia. And we put in the speech that we were still interested in talking to the Taliban if they were still interested in talking to us. They were not. And you see how long it took then for substantive negotiation to come back with Ambassador Khalilzad. It took years. And so I've come to think after all this time that people have to be ready on both sides. That you can't have a one-sided negotiation where I'm ready to negotiate and you're not. You can help create the conditions. For example, why did the Taliban negotiate with me? Well, because they were getting they were under enormous military pressure from US forces, right? They didn't like it. And so you can create conditions, but you can't create them all. and people have to be ready to talk. And so this is hard, and I know that's not a great answer because there are no hard rules here. But that's one of the artistic pieces of diplomacy, I think.
Definitely a great point you make. So last question before we wrap things up. I noticed in the background you have a lot of books on those shelves. Do you have any specific book recommendations for someone working in the foreign policy space?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there are some historical books that I think people should read. And I tend to read about American diplomacy. One of the things that American diplomats think, we don't have a history, right? There's no history of American diplomacy. Well, there is, goes all the way back to Benjamin Franklin. And so I love reading about kind of historical events in American diplomacy, where things, American diplomats played some important role. I've always tried to read a lot also about negotiations, at the end of the First World War. What happened there? Why didn't it go very well? So I tried to read a lot about that. I also think a lot about leadership. There are at the moment some very good books out. I think as people consider what it takes to be a great leader, General James Mattis just published a book called Call Sign Chaos. I recognize my bias. I worked for Colin Powell, so he's got a book called It Worked for Me, which is 18 or 19 vignettes. It's back there somewhere about what worked for him in his career. One I always recommend is called Thinking in Time. It's a little bit of an older book, but it's by two Harvard professors, and it's about the uses and misuses of analogy, where you walk up to a problem and say, oh, I recognize this, I did this before. And they give you a checklist to make sure that that's actually right, and that you don't misuse history and misuse analogy. I read to be interested, and I said from the very beginning to just fulfill curiosity about a lot of things.
I will definitely need to add a couple of those books to my reading list. So Ambassador Grossman, I just want to thank you for joining us for what has been a lively and enjoyable discussion. Do you have any closing remarks you would like to share with the audience?
Just first of all, thank you very much. I admire you for your interest and effort here. As I said, this is, you're next up here. And so the more you can have these conversations and think about it, I think it's great. I apologize that perhaps we didn't get to all the questions, but I hope someday you'll have me back, and I wish you all well.
We'll definitely look forward to that. I also want to thank the YPFP members in attendance for spending time with us today and for their continued engagement with our global community. I'll be sending out a follow-up email for all participants with information regarding Ambassador Grossman's novel and the exciting project he's working on with Harvard. So please keep an eye out for any upcoming events in our newsletters and on our website at ypfp.org. If you're not currently a YPFP member, we encourage you to become a member today. Everyone, take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you, Ambassador.
Jeffrey, thank you very much. Thank you.